We started in the middle of COVID. I suppose that's something that made us understand the importance of the intersection between medicine and humanities, perhaps like never before, at least at a scale that we didn't understand that intersection beyond specific research intersection. And since then, we've been fortunate to have a very diverse set of speakers from different countries, UK, US, India, of course, and also South Africa and Greece. In fact, we started with a speaker from Greece, I remember. And we've talked about many things. Just to give you a little bit of a context behind the seminar series and the rationale, it's initiated by Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Gandhinagar, and it's meant to open up dialogues between medicine, humanities, and literary and cultural studies by dwelling on their intersections that operate in the cultural field of medicine. The seminar series encourages discussions on trauma, suffering, loss, grief, recovery, coping mechanisms, transformed identities, and so on. The presentations have covered and will cover various subdisciplines within medical humanities, such as medical theater. In fact, we started with that 4 semesters back, medical sociology, clinical anthropology, psychoanalysis, and medical literature. The talks conducted by the respective field experts and leaders will encounter and accentuate the granular details of clinical communication, clinical care spaces, familial care, written and oral narratives of the patients, etc., that seldom get highlighted in the data-oriented clinical studies. So with that as a sort of background, let me request Angel, who's the co-organizer of the series. She's a Sabarmati Fellow working on a medical humanities project here. And let me request her to introduce formally Avishek Parui, who is our speaker today. Dr. Avishek Parui teaches in IIT Madras. And though we have known each other, we haven't properly had an in-person meeting or an adda at some point in the future. So I'll leave the formal introduction to Angel. Thank you so much, Dr. Parui.
Thank you, sir. To formally introduce our speaker for the day, Dr. Avishek Parui is an associate professor in English and Memory Studies at IIT Madras and an associate fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. He's the author of Postmodern Literatures, which was published by Orient Black Swan in 2018, and Culture and the Literary, Matter, Metaphor, Memory, which was published by Roman and Littlefield in 2022. He's the principal investigator of the Center for Memory Studies at IIT Madras and the founding chairperson of the Indian Network for Memory Studies. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Avishek Parui. This is such a pleasure to be able to host you at IIT Gandhinagar. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Can I get started? Oh, okay, terrific. So at the very outset, I apologize for the slight technical glitch on my end. I mean, you'd think all these years in IIT would teach you something in terms of smoothness and technology, but it never ceases to surprise you. And thank you very much for inviting me, Dr. Chattopadhyay, and also Angel. I've been following this series with great interest in the last few months or so, and they've been having some really interesting speakers. And it's a great pleasure and honor for me to be part of this colloquium as well. And I do look forward to some engaging questions and comments, and do see some familiar faces as well. So this particular topic, I'm sort of bringing in together certain strands, as you may have probably guessed from the title itself: plasticity, chunking, and implicit collective memory. So I'll start with plasticity first, and I'll move on to what I mean conceptually by chunking. And then I'll end the session with reference to Astrid Erll's most recent publication on implicit collective memory. And the hope, obviously, is to make a conceptual connect across the three terms, and perhaps end with a nod to literary studies. That's my background at the end of the day. And in terms of locating literature as a really interesting field, really, or a medium through which all these different concepts can be brought together, not just as representational or ontological categories, but also as sort of experiments to understand cognition, experiments to understand what we call self, this entire complex neural mechanism through which the brain becomes the mind, which becomes a self, etc. So where does literature fit in? That would be my concluding point in this session. So first things first, I'm obviously drawing on Catherine Malabou's very wonderful work in plasticity. And what fascinates one when one reads Malabou is a range with which she operates plasticity as the sort of the continental philosophical legacy that she draws on, starting on from Kant and Heidegger, and obviously, looking at Derrida directly, as all of you would know, she was a direct scholar of Derrida, and it's very post-structuralist notion of plasticity. But what interests me more is how she connects that very interesting philosophical terrain to a pretty hardcore neural terrain as well. And one can think of her work, the most recent work, which is actually called Plasticity, The Promise of Explosion, which was published, I think, this year or maybe the year earlier. The one I have is this year. But it's a really rich range of essays. And that title itself, I just want to do a little bit on that title, The Promise of Explosion. That itself is such a provocative title in so many ways. There is this ontological quality about the title, the promise of explosion, the promise of the pattern which hasn't happened yet, the promise of an arrival, the explosion as an arrival, the explosion as de-territorialization. But of course, she also draws on Deleuze to a large extent, because the de-territorialized also becomes re-territorialized, so that there is a temporal category about explosion as well. But, in terms of how she looks at plasticity as very generically speaking, as a system which can accept as well as produce forms. There's a formal quality about plasticity that she opens with, something which can accept, accommodate, as well as produce patterns, produce forms. And the wonderful thing about the definition, or the elegance of this definition, if you will, is how we can connect across so many different disciplines. I'm going to talk a little bit about how this connects to some really interesting work on epigenetics, for instance, moving on to the sort of the genetic determinism of the self, and instead looking at how this constant iteration as well as the interaction between the self and the environment, how that can sort of emancipate this genetic determinism to a certain extent and move on to sort of more pattern-making self, the pattern-loving self. And how patterns can be a narrative formation as well, how the self and the environment establish a pattern, a symbiotic pattern relationship. So epigenetics is an obvious connect, an obvious resonance that one can draw on. And Malabou also refers to epigenetics, perhaps not very heavily, but there is that constant allusion to epigenetics as well. But also how, if you just go back to continental philosophy, to stay there for maybe a couple of minutes, what this also does in a very revolutionary way, I think, the idea of plasticity, is to look at the transcendental as a different category as well, because she goes right back to Kant. I mean, one can understand Derrida and even Heidegger for the matter, and of course, Deleuze and Guattari, all this post-structuralist philosophers working in that tradition. But I think the really revolutionary thing that Malabou does in the notion of plasticity is she goes back to Kant and talks about how even the transcendental is plastic in quality, right? So the transcendental is an open category. The transcendental is something which can be salvaged, can be redeemed from any sort of stagnation in terms of epistemic stagnation. But the transcendental is always already plastic in a certain sense. So with this framework in mind, if one looks at the biomedical, the neurodivergent ontology that she does touch upon in her work, the most recent work. I mean, she has been working on this for a number of years, the new wounded, what can we know about the brain? So there is that strand throughout her work, but I think it sort of crystallizes in this new title, The Plasticity, Promise of Explosion. It has sort of 4 different sections, and the last being the medical, the biomedical neural category, where there's a reference to epigenetics as well. Now, the reason why this interests me as someone who studies as a student of memory and someone who engages in memory studies is the very interesting resonance that one can think of when one looks at some of the newer works in memory studies coming from neuroscience as well, in terms of looking at memory or even remembering for that matter, not so much as some kind of a static category, but also as an act of reconstruction. And that's a term that increasingly finds currency in memories, is reconstruction. Memory not so much an act of remembering, but an act of reconstruction. And the obvious scientist that I can think of, and I'm just going to move on to chunking now, but then I think I may as well refer to him right away, is Joseph LeDoux. Because if you look at LeDoux's work on the synaptic self, for instance, this magnificent work called Synapses. Although he works more on anxiety, amygdala, but there's this constant engagement with memory as well. But what LeDoux does in a very interesting way is to sort of foreground the idea of the synaptic self. And I think that synaptic self in itself becomes conceptually, in a very interesting way, connectable to what Malabou does with the entire notion of plasticity as a philosophical category, as an epistemic category, as an ontological category, but also as a biological category. And there's this currency so connects across so many disciplines and domains. It's absolutely fascinating. But if you sort of do a little bit on LeDoux's work, where the theory that we are not so much what happens in terms of neurons, but rather what we end up becoming is what happens between the neurons, the synapses, the engagement between neurons, that liminal space, the interstitial space, if you will, where exchange of information takes place, where electrochemical firing happens, the passage between the firing and the receiving. That is where the self is produced. And that's actually, in a very cheeky sense, a very post-structuralist thing to say as a neuroscientist, right? A very postmodernist thing to say as a neuroscientist. I'm not entirely sure if LeDoux is aware of the theories of postmodernism, although he's a guitarist and he runs some band as well, so I wouldn't be very surprised. But there is an obvious connection that we can make as students of literature, as students of critical theory, because it comes from hardcore neuroscience, right? It comes from a very respectable neuroscientist who's written volumes of work on anxiety, amygdala, synapses, really revolutionary work. And the whole idea of the self, and again, this is something we see in neuroscience today, almost an obsession to move beyond the molecular mechanism of the brain and perhaps engaging with a broader dimension where the brain becomes the mind becomes the self becomes a subject. It's a constant push towards a more complex understanding of cognition, activity, iteration, etc. And one can think of the works of Eric Kandel, Antonio Damasio. It was actually published books on Spinoza. Damasio has published books on Descartes, Spinoza. So obviously there is that tradition coming in from neuroscience as well, to perhaps make a bridge between philosophy and neuroscience. And of course, someone like Patricia Churchland has already worked on this, the neurophilosophy tradition as well. But if we just stick to LeDoux over here and maybe establish a dialogue between his work and Malabou's work in terms of looking at plasticity as an ontological condition, but also plasticity as an act of iteration, constant engagement with the environment, the self and the inside and the outside, and how what we call the self, the entire ontology of the self, is a product of this engagement, is a product of this activity. Now, what that allows us to do conceptually is to perhaps move away from an ontological understanding of memory and perhaps sort of allow us to look at memory as a verb, as an activity, as something which happens, as something which is becoming, unbecoming, rebecoming, right? The constant negotiation with meanings. In fact, again, I'm drawing on LeDoux. There's this fascinating theory which has got some currency in neuroscience, and that theory is a reconsolidation theory of the reconsolidation model of memory. And again, LeDoux is one of the biggest proponents of this theory. That argues in a very interesting way that what you remember is actually not the original memory of the event, but in fact, the latest remembered version of the event. And every act of reconstruction is drawing on the latest remembered version. So there is an obvious slippage which happens every time we remember, every time we reconstruct. So there is this textual quality that is very much there in the vocabulary of neuroscience as well. And, it's very tempting, and I do make the connection to sort of establish the resonance, the dialogue between what Malabou would define as plasticity as an ontological category, as a functional category, as an epistemic category, but also as a biological category. And at some point, these sort of mix together in ways which can liberate, but at the same time destroy. And in fact, the last chapter on Malabou's plasticity, the promise of explosion, talks about the dark plasticity. She's done this before as well. The New Wounded had touched upon that as well. But there is that ambivalence about plasticity as well, because it's a little bit like postmodernism, if you think about it. To look at postmodernism only as an emancipatory category, or only as a category which liberates from grand narratives, is probably slightly reductionist, right? There is an ambivalence about postmodernism as well, in terms of how it can very quickly allow itself to be co-opted into a grand narrative, very quickly allow itself to be appropriated by a grand narrative, and then it becomes something else. And that ambivalence in postmodernism is something that we as students of literature must pay very close attention to. It's so seductive to look at postmodernism as something that just breaks grand narratives and liberates itself, et cetera, but it's actually more complex than that. Hence the very uneasy tension between Marxism and postmodernism, which is obviously, that's a different debate to be had. Delicious, but not for this particular session. Now, sticking to the whole idea of plasticity, and what I'm trying to do here in the first section of this session is to look at how the hardcore neuroscience and hardcore continental philosophy are actually using the same concept to talk about things which are not very dissimilar, right? The whole idea of the neurodivergent brain, the whole idea of the plastic brain, the whole idea of the brain which is constantly producing, deproducing, reproducing meaning, and constantly producing slipperiness. Because if we go with the argument that what becomes a self is not so much a neural network, but rather a synaptic network, then obviously we're subscribing to the idea that what really makes us what we are as meaning-making, pattern-seeking mammals is actually what happens between the neurons, right? That moment, that almost a homibhava moment where, messages are sent and received, that territory between that, right? I'm not going to talk about bhava, I promise, right? Now, with that connection in mind, let me just move on to the next concept that I had in the title, which is chunking. Again, what I'm trying to do in this section is to look at how the concept is used in very different directions, in very different disciplines, perhaps unintentionally. I'm not entirely sure they know each other, but the two people I referred to in this section, again, LeDoux, who is looking at chunking as a very interesting phenomenon through which memory is operated, where, and he's not the only one to say this, and a lot of neuroscientists are saying this as well, in terms of how the brain is constantly chunking in and chunking out information. So any act of encoding, which becomes memory, is a process of chunking. You sort of chunk in information. You can take a very vulgar example. So, for instance, if I were to ask someone what happened on a certain date, you're more likely to say that, well, I went to a conference, met someone, etc. So obviously what you're doing is you're chunking in certain bits which are interesting. You're not going to say how many times the hand moved when you brushed your teeth, because you don't remember it, right? You're not going to say what happened right after you had your coffee, because you've managed to forget it. You've chunked out this information. So chunking is a very key cognitive process through which we make memories, rather. And what that obviously means is forgetting becomes a key component of the process of remembering, because you have to sort of forget away this extra information in order to sort of create a narrative pattern through which you can make sense. So what happened yesterday must be a narrative which connects to what happened today. That's the way we can sort of make sense of the world as we move along. If we are to remember every single detail of what happened yesterday, that would actually create an impediment to the narrative process. So it's very important that you chunk away certain information as well. And so the entire molecular mechanism of memory, according to this really rich research in neuroscience, again, headed by LeDoux, I'm sure there are others as well, is actually looking at chunking as not just a cognitive category, but almost a narrative category. And it's interesting how neuroscience is looking at narratives in the brain in a very interesting way. The molecular mechanism becomes a narrative, the synaptic mechanism becomes a narrative, etc. Now, the really fascinating thing, and this is one of those rare discovery moments in literary studies research, because, we don't discover much, we just read and write. But there are these moments where we are lucky to step into something which allows us to feel like a discoverer, is how the exact word chunking is used by a cognitive narratologist, David Herman. The exact word, right? And the way Herman uses chunking is fascinating. He talks about how cultures chunk in information. Like, for instance, every culture which produces, let's say, its unique fairy tales or ghost stories or whatever the case may be, the narrative patterns of a culture is a constant process of chunking. So you chunk in information, which becomes fairy tales, and chunk in information, which becomes, let's say, a collective memory, etc. So every culture produces its own unique chunks of information, which can go in different directions. It can go in, let's say, the fairy tale direction, some of the discursive direction. But the fundamental point being here is how the whole way in which the collective narrative operates, through which you remember information, through which you pass on information in an intergenerational way, and let's say through textual transmission, through oral narratives, whatever the method may be. It also entails a process of chunking, right? So again, we're looking at this very interesting interplay of inclusion and exclusion, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how this has really profound and complex replications in the way we can study collective memory as well, because even collective memory may be seen as a very, not just a dialectic, but I think it's less innocent than a dialectic in a certain way. There is this constant tension and interplay to leave out certain things as well. And obviously what gets left out in the chunking process can sometimes be more revealing than what gets left in. Right? So why do certain things get left out? What does it tell us about the, let's say, the discursive design of the particular time, of the ideological impulse of the particular time? These things become really revealing. So why do certain things suddenly become less important? Why do certain things suddenly become more foregrounded, more accentuated, etc.? And you notice I'm already started the literary vocabulary: foregrounding, accentuation, focalization, because that's what I'm trying to end this session with. But staying with chunking here, I think it's absolutely crucial that we, as students of memory studies, students of cultural studies, really celebrate this convergence, because maybe it's an accidental convergence, but how the exact same word is used in very different disciplines to sort of mean the same thing in a molecular way, the micromolecular mechanism of memory, through which the neuroscientists are telling us the brain is constantly chunking in information and making sense of the world. That gives a sort of spatio-temporal sense to the self in terms of how it moves ahead in time, and also how it moves back in time, and this constant bidirectional quality through which memory operates. And also, we see how, in a more macro perspective, narratologists are telling us how this is the way cultures also move ahead. This is the way in which cultures sort of resurrect information. This is the way cultures, let's say, clinically cut away information. It's always a process of chunking. Now, obviously, we can get more discursive, more culture studies, and look at the way in which, the inclusions and exclusions reveal things about that particular culture, reveal things about the politics of the time, the design of the time, etc. But I'm not going to go there at the moment. I'm going to stay theoretical, because I'm more interested in looking at how the micro and macro models of cognition are intersecting over here, right? And of course, we can map this connection into, let's say, a specific study of a specific culture and a specific regime. So that's just something we can go subsequently. But at this moment, I think it's more interesting as a student of memory studies and literature and culture to look at the theoretical overlap between the micro and the macro, which brings us to something which I think connects the first two terms in an interesting way. The whole idea of forgetting, right? So if you look at plasticity, if you look at chunking, and that obviously begs that we engage with the idea of forgetting, absence. How do you study absence over here? Is absence an ontological category? Is absence a neural category? So how do you calibrate absence? Of course, it's one can do a very interesting political study of absence in terms of collective memory or oblivion. Lots of people have studied it from anthropology. Mark Ort comes to mind, and lots of people you can think of. Paul Connaughton's got a fascinating article, 7 Types of Forgetting. But if we sort of go back and look at how Malabou is looking at plasticity, and how the idea of chunking comes into being later, the way that LeDoux and Herman are engaging with that as well. And if we attempt to connect these 3 terms, plasticity, chunking, and forgetting, what we see immediately is, right, but there is also, I think, a very interesting molecular mechanism of absence that one can also think of. So if you're looking at chunking and plasticity, has also neural categories, has also biological categories, that also has interesting replications in terms of how you study absence. And again, if you go back to Malabou here, the whole idea of plasticity, the promise of an explosion, to which the book ends, and the last bit is the interesting bit where she talks about the arrival of an explosion and what happens after the explosion, and we can go post-humanist about it as well. But if we stick to the ontological dimension of explosion in terms of something which produces an absence, in terms of something which produces nothingness for the matter, but the interesting thing is, it doesn't stop there, does it? Right? There's this temporal category about absence as well. It sort of flows into something and becomes some kind of a quasi-presence. Now, the same may be said in an interesting sense about forgetting, because we also know through scientific research that just like we don't have perfect memory, there's also no such thing as perfect forgetting, right? There is always this residual quality about forgetting, and the more interesting work in that direction is in trauma studies, in terms of how triggers can revive information, triggers can revive certain memories, and how forgetting can become a coping mechanism, how forgetting can become a healing mechanism. But if we have sort of try to resist the temptation and go in the clinical direction and stay in the cognitive dimension, which is more interesting, I think, because the clinical dimension is obvious, forgetting, trauma, triggers. A lot of medical research happens in that direction. That's wonderful. But I think the more complex dimension that one can look at is the cognitive dimension, and where we look at absence and forgetting as a cognitive category. So, and obviously I'm not giving a neat answer over here, but all I'm asking is perhaps an engagement with forgetting as an absent category, but also absence as something which may become a representational category, may become a remembered category, may become an ontological category. And I think the operative word here is may, because there is a temporal quality about that, there's a spatial quality about it, there's an ontological quality about that as well. And I think that interstitial quality about absence and forgetting, the liminality, if you want a more posh term, the liminal quality about absence and forgetting is exactly what makes it so easily connected to the whole idea of plasticity, the way that Malabou looks at, and also chunking, the way that LeDoux and narratologists such as Herman are looking at. Because every act of encoding, whether it happens in the brain, whether it happens in a cultural sphere, is also de-encoding information, is also sort of liquidating information, shutting down certain things as well. But then that shutting down is not complete either. That can sort of come back in a spectral way, that can come back and through triggers, that can come back through different kinds of ontological, linguistic interventions. And then, that can trigger up certain things in almost the electrochemical way, just like, you can trigger up the brain in certain ways, which can reproduce information, reproduce and revive and resurrect memory. So that can also be operative in a cultural sphere. A forgotten building suddenly becomes important. A forgotten piece of real estate suddenly becomes important and suddenly becomes political and volatile, et cetera, et cetera. So, that ability of absence to constantly produce presence, I think, is something which is there in a neural way, in a very hardcore molecular mechanism of cognition and memory, but also in a more macro narrative cultural dimension of memory. And I think what I hope to have established by this point in the session is my engagement with memory as a micro quality, something which happens inside the brain, but also how it is constantly spilling over and producing patterns and consuming patterns from what is outside. And, one can think of the philosopher Andy Clark in terms of how he looks at, he uses a very interesting metaphor of leaking. And I really like this metaphor. It's the brain as something which is constantly leaking in information and leaking out information. There's something porous about the brain, almost an osmosis-like thing. The sort of world gets in and the brain gets out. It's very asymmetric, very messed up. Hence the whole idea of the situated brain. I think I really like that phrase, situated brain, that Clark uses. Now, taking all this, let me just jump to the last bit, the last concept that I thought I'd touch on a little bit in this session, which is Erll's notion of implicit collective memory. And I think that's really interesting because if you read that essay, she's talking about how what she does essentially in the essay is make a bridge between implicit memory, study in psychology, the non-declarative memory in terms of how you remember swimming, for instance. Once you learn it, it's just there in your body. Someone pushes you in the water, you begin to swim right away. Cycling, swimming, there's motor muscle memory, which is there in the body. And collective memory in terms of how, you create monuments, museums, read history books, etc. And what she does, I think, in a very innovative way, is to make the connect between the implicit residual non-declarative memory in the brain and trying to engage whether there's something similar in culture as well. Things you don't talk about, things you don't build monuments for, things you don't go to museums for, but you remember in some strange way, right? It's just there. And obviously, what that does, it brings in the whole idea of memory bias in a very heavy way. And how do certain collectives remember information through a very biased form? And Erll gives a series of examples. She starts off by looking at the historical memory of the Second World War. And she says, for instance, if you ask a Russian about the Second World War, very heavily emphasized on, let's say, the Battle of Berlin and the raid of Moscow. So that would be the entire dimension through which the war will be remembered. If you ask an American, the Second World War started with the Pearl Harbor attack. So it depends on how you're framing the narrative, how you're framing the memory. So again, that just becomes part of the implicit collective memory. And it's really interesting because it's not overtly propaganda. I mean, that would be easy to locate, right? It's sort of taught in history books, et cetera, but it's more complex than that. It's more complex than propaganda. It operates through tangible and intangible apparatus. It operates through effective as well as affective apparatus. There is a very affective quality about implicit collective memory that Erll talks about in great detail. And she actually ends the essay with a reference to the 1857 War of Independence, which she picks up on the word mutiny. And she says, if you ask a British historian what that was, they would say it's a mutiny. And the very word mutiny obviously frames in a very different way. It's an illegitimate, illegal war. Some soldiers got drunk and they rose against legal authority. So it just becomes almost like a courtroom thing, right? Whereas if you look at from an Indian perspective, it is perhaps the first real war of independence, which almost shook the empire. And we all know what happened after that. The Queen took over. British presence became heavily militarized in India. And one can break the entire British presence as pre-1857 and post-1857. The massive militarization which happened after that war was like a wake-up call. And the Queen taking over the company is obviously not just symbolic, but it's like a complete political paradigm shift. However, the interesting thing, obviously, is how it is remembered in British history to mutiny. Now, the reason why I think implicit collective memory is obviously is interesting, but how it can connect to plasticity and connect to chunking is, again, the thing that I've been talking about from the very beginning, the constant convergence between the brain and the world, the constant convergence of the neurons and the narratives, right? In terms of how you process information inside through certain filters, through certain chunks, through certain biases. And that's nice and medical and experimental. But what is also interesting is how very similar structural apparatus are operating in the world outside as well, in terms of how narratives are like neurons just out there, in terms of how they're passing information, how they're withholding information, more interesting, and how they're decelerating information, accelerating information. And of course, one can do a very interesting digital humanities take on this, so which I will not, but it's an obvious direction to go in terms of how information is distributed. And the whole idea of distributive cognition is a big deal in cognitive studies as well as in digital humanities. How we move on from a top-down model to a more distributed model. In fact, Malabou talks about that to a certain extent. It talks about late capitalism, inventing a more distributed pattern to look more inclusive, but actually that just has the opposite effect. The intended effect is just the opposite. Instead of making it more inclusive, it actually becomes more totalitarian, but in a more covert way in terms of how it spreads its branches in very insidious ways. So I think if you look at plasticity, just to sort of wind up, if you look at plasticity as an ontological category, as a category which allows us to look at the self as a product of an interaction between the biological mammal, the biological neural, molecular, atomic individual and the self which is produced by the world, the constant interaction which takes place. And if you look at chunking as a very similar interaction which happens in the brain as well as in terms of collective memory, in terms of how cultures make sense, how cultures sustain themselves, how cultures legitimize and forgive themselves by chunking in certain bits of information, chunking out. I know, for instance, I talked about British history. It's very interesting to look at how the empire is read in British history books, right? In terms of whether it was a shameful event or whether that was something which, killed a few people but gave railways, right? So that, again, that framing is very interesting in terms of how that should be passed on to the subsequent generations. And these obviously have profound political consequences in terms of how the glory narrative of the nation, how the inglorious should be kept away, made more glorious. And we can think of more like real biological political figures, Churchill being an excellent case in point, in terms of how he's remembered subsequently, very carefully facing away Bengal famine and so many other things, but rather saying, remembering him as a war hero for the Nazis. Right? So there's constant chunking which takes place. But obviously what that also means is, at the end of the day, we're looking at all these things as very interesting mutable categories. Memory as a mutable category, identity as a mutable category, self as a mutable category. And the mutability is molecular, and the mutability is also cultural, right? And the mutability operates at a level of narrative. So I think what this brings us to, at the end of this slightly messy session, is looking at memory studies and medical humanities, obviously as dialoguing. We know that by now, but maybe perhaps locate where the dialogue happens the best, locate the interface where that dialogue, that intersection can perhaps take place most complexly. And I would argue, perhaps you can call me a dinosaur, but I would argue literature is a place where that happens most complexly. That liminal medium which plays between reality and possibility, that territory which tells us what really happened with what could have happened, is exactly where that intersection takes place best. And I mean, we have a lot of really interesting work going on everywhere, really, about different kinds of reality, augmented reality, virtual reality. We have some fascinating technology which produces magnificent results in terms of how we can look at reality in a different way. But I make the argument that we got there first. The novel is perhaps the first text of augmented reality in terms of how we can create a more defamiliarized version. You can go back to formalists about this, but a more defamiliarized version of reality, which allows us to see how encoding happens. Right? I mean, even something as simple as the opening line of Pride and Prejudice. That's such a classic example of encoding. The chunks getting in, right? And if you can decode that, you can find out so much about that. One sentence can give you such a magnificent idea of the helplessness of a woman, of the feudal economy around that time in terms of the transference of property, the legislation around it, and also the sexual expectation. I mean, every wealthy man must be heterosexual, right? So every man who is moneyed must be marrying a woman to create more men and carry on that legacy. So that one line can pick so much. So I think at the end of the day, we talk about plasticity as a divergent category, as a conceptual category, as a category which allows us to look at ourselves as a constant interaction between environment and the biology, and also how that can emancipate as well as enslave, perhaps sometimes simultaneously. If we look at chunking as a process through which molecules chunk in information, chunk out information, and how similar structures are being replicated outside as well in cultural, social, discursive space. And lastly, if we look at implicit collective memory as exactly that, that sort of biased affective formation through which we produce, deproduce, and reproduce information to make sense of the world. I think the convergent point, in my very old-fashioned view of academia, is the literary novel, is the literary text, which I think, first of all, there is added dimension because it is embedded as well as enactive, right? It is language, it's something inside the brain. So we read a novel, you actually, in a very direct cognitive way, you're engaging with something already inside your brain, right? But at the same time, there's a performative quality of literature, which is why Finnegan's Wake is experimental and the statesman or the newspaper that read in the morning is not. Different registers of writing, right? So that performative dimension of writing, the performative dimension of language, which is both cognitive and performative, I think allows us to look at these concepts in really interesting ways. And I think so this research, which is a confluence, let's say, with memory studies and medical humanities, I think we as students of literature, we should foreground the literary text, literary medium, literary landscape, perhaps a little more heavily in terms of understanding how this confluence can take place in really complex ways. So thank you very much for this session, and I look forward to questions and engagements if there are any.
Thank you so much, Professor Parui, for this very rich and multi-layered talk. If I may take the opportunity of being the host to ask the first question, as others, I'm sure, are formulating theirs. It's a question, I guess, that kind of goes back to the relation between, so, I mean, these are clarifying questions more than anything else. And I'm thinking about certain aspects of Malabou's work that might again tie back with the point that you're making about absence, especially the way she very speculatively and somewhat perhaps indecisively reads plasticity in relation to death drive. Mm-hmm. Whether that could be again a horizon of absence in certain senses, and also generally just thinking of where one could make a line of differentiation between what is chunking and what in a more classical sense was called repressed memory. So where would one draw the line? Because in a certain sense, of course, we unconsciously repress things, and one could say chunking is more ideologically conscious, but at the same time, sometimes there is conscious repression as well, which again, and again, I'm not being very grammatical when it comes to psychoanalysis here, but I'm just observing the fact that sometimes we see this in subjective experience, that the line between repression and suppression also gets erased out to a very large extent, and it is not very easy to differentiate between what is repressed and what is suppressed. So these are two, I suppose, I'm not very sure where the question lies in this, but I'm just wondering if you'd have a thought to respond to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the whole idea of the death drive is fascinating, and I think Malabou has this really interesting relationship with Freud, isn't it? It's almost like a resentful daughter who can't let go of the father, but at the same time hates the father. There is that constant tension. But I think what we get in Malabou's writing about Freud and also elsewhere is that, as debatable or as contested Freud may be today, there's one thing that is really interesting, which is so true about Freud, and that's something which is increasingly corroborated by neuroscience today, is that the biggest chunks of cognition, if I'm using the word chunking here, the biggest domains of cognition, the way we operate throughout the day, actually relies so much on the unconscious, right? The non-conscious quality about cognition is just fundamental. If we actually become conscious of the things we do around us all the time, in terms of how the motor movements happen, in terms of even how memory works, really, if there's constant intrusion of consciousness, the constant intrusion of cognition, that I'm sort of metacognitive, I'm cognizing my cognition, that would actually really mess up the brain in really fundamental ways. So I think Freud is really interesting because as speculative as it may have been centuries ago, that theory about the relevance of the unconscious in terms of the how it governs and shapes the subject, the self, the personality, the persona, and you can just keep pushing forward in time. But that unconscious is so important, and I think you're absolutely spot on in terms of how Malabou makes the equation between plasticity and death drive, because there is that ambivalence about death drive as well, right? It is obviously a drive towards annihilation, etc. But it doesn't stop there. It's more complex than that. There's also this, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for? Maybe aspiration or fantasy, but it's not there quite. But there is that latent desire, perhaps, for recreation as well. So you annihilate something, but obviously it can't end there. And that's why I mentioned the temporal category as well. There is a sequel to it, what happens after the explosion. Is there like, a new pattern emerging? And I think, very classically and perhaps a little bit bluntly, one can go to Deleuze for a convenient, quick fix answer for this, in terms of how the deterritorialized is perhaps always already re-territorialized, right? There's this constant move towards a new form of territorialization. So yes, the dead drive and plasticity are really interesting comparisons. So perhaps I should elaborate more on that. And in terms of looking at the repressed and the suppressed, again, it's a fascinating question, but you're spot on when you say there is no line. We can't sort of locate this is where the repressed ends and the suppressed begins, right? And my very modest response to that would be, well, maybe the repressed and the suppressed operate simultaneously in certain ways, but then there are also moments where, let's say, something like Manto's Tobatek thing, which really flips it open and creates this really scary fault line in terms of what I want to remember, what I want to repress, and what the state wants to suppress. And those are like completely different things. So that one short story, I keep going back to it. I think, we can study politically, of course, we should, but also psychologically, it's such a fascinating story because there is exactly that happening, as you just mentioned. There is a maybe unconscious repression of certain moments in the past that I don't want to remember anymore. And then there is state-sponsored suppression in terms of your village doesn't exist anymore. And those are like different categories, right? So I think that story really creates this fault line, a spectacular fault line, which can help us engage with looking at these two as different ontological and almost neural categories. But of course, in a more commonsensical way, the repressed and the suppressed are entangled in ways that we can't sort of disentangle. And that's why I find someone like Andy Clark so helpful as looking at, someone asked me the other day that, why brain? Why not the mind? Why not a situated mind? But I think the brain is more deliberately provocative, but actually it more sense as well, because he's actually saying that the neural is cultural, right? Mind cultural, everyone knows that. We have had years of cultural studies to teach us that. But when someone says the neural is cultural, the molecular is cultural, that is actually more interesting and perhaps more true. So I think the suppress repressing happens exactly on the same lines. That what you repress is perhaps what you're asked to suppress, right? And there are those moments like Tobatek saying, well, the fault lines open up. But I think the most seamless way in which we forget is perhaps through a constant consumption of what we're asked to forget at political discursive levels. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for that very rich answer. I'll withhold my other questions for now. There might be questions from the floor. I can see a question from Ingrida. Let me read it out to you. Thank you very much. That's very interesting and informative. I don't have any questions at this stage, but it made me thinking about how it is applicable to translation, and specifically censorship and self-censorship of translation, and also about what and how we remember about the very periods in history when censorship was applied on the state level.
Yeah. No, translation is fascinating because towards the end of the session, I touched upon language, the whole idea of defamiliarization, augmented reality, etc. But that just goes up a notch further with translation, because where study of certain periods in history where censorship was applied on a state level, let's say in a very, let's just for the sake of argument, say in a very overt way, in a very spectacular way, where it is being censored, and these things are forbidden to be remembered, etc., forbidden to be engaged with. And of course, the entire over of Milan Kundera comes to mind in terms of how, we have entire generations which are taught to forget, mustn't remember, etc. But a really interesting film comes to my mind as well in terms of how, forgetting operates in political ways, but also in direct medical ways. And that film I have in mind is Goodbye Lenin, by Wolfgang Becker, which actually talks about someone who suffers trauma, goes into a coma, wakes up. That happens in East Berlin, and she wakes up in what is now a unified Berlin. The Berlin Wall has fallen. There's no East Germany, West Germany anymore. And what that does to the subject, I think it's a fascinating film. Someday I do hope to do something more academic with it rather than just mention it in passing. But I think it's a film which really brings together the neural traumatic mechanism of forgetting, remembering, through, let's say, a direct attack on the brain, someone who actually goes into a coma, and connects it in very complex ways to the politics of forgetting. The Berlin Wall has fallen. So that era is not forgotten. And that magnificent scene where the statue of Lenin is flown away and almost waves goodbye to the earlier communist subject is, that moment where the intersection happens between the brain and the mind and the world, right? But thank you for the question. But I think the whole idea of censorship has a very complex relation to forgetting, because there is that injunction about memory. You're not allowed to remember, you're not allowed to represent, remember, etc. And that has profound implications, which are psychological, of course, but also discursive. And again, I think this is the discussion I was having with Professor Chattopadhyay. We can't put a finger and say this is where the neurons end and the narratives begin, right? So the neurons are already part of the narrative, and the narratives are formed by neurons. So there is that messy structure, which is why literature is so interesting.
Thank you so much. I think we have 2 raised hands. So if you go one by one, please. I'm not sure if I'll be able to pronounce the first name correctly. Orlean, Gabriel, and then Vishnu, maybe. Thank you. You could unmute yourselves and speak. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I am a PhD student working in memory and trauma studies. I'm studying Rwandan literature. So I'm working a lot with genocide. Because my focus is more literary and post-colonial, I'm very interested in your work and in the work of this medical humanities and bringing neuropsychoscience to the literary world. My question for you is, in your personal opinion and from your personal experience, how does one interact with the literary world and do good literary criticism without entering into that sort of love-hate relationship with Freud? Because Freud is so present in all of memory studies,
and respond by saying, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. I think we could just, but the more expansive point, obviously, is sometimes the literary is just a literary. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, because sometimes we get seduced away by the entire apparatus, the industry of theory, for instance, coming in and taking over for the matter. But that's why I use the very banal example of Jane Austen towards the end. Just pick up that one line and do a textual reading of it, right? And that can reveal so much. So I think it's important for us to acknowledge and perhaps articulate, I don't know, for want of a better word, the autonomy of the literary, that it can actually stand on its own. It is a rich medium, which doesn't require help from other mediums to sort of muscle up and be studied today. But I think we are seeing something which is going in the opposite direction. We have neuroscientists quoting Keats. We have people who are writing on Nabokov. I mean, Eric Kendall's was written this book called Memory from Mind to Molecules, where he's quoting Virginia Woolf. Right. So I think we are seeing something in an entirely opposite direction. So I think as students of literature, both of us, we should sort of stand on the ground and say that this is just enough. This is an autonomous thing. And just a study of the literary language, the literary medium, the semantic possibilities, the semantic arrangements and combinations and complexities can reveal so much without a recourse to either psychoanalysis or critical theory, etc. So I think and this is a danger which I think we are facing as, as academics for the last maybe 15, 20 years, that it's almost impossible to talk about literature without borrowing the vocabulary from, let's say, theory or culture studies or psychoanalysis, etc., which is fine. But what happens sometimes in a process is that just becomes the dominant version of reading a text, and the text just slips away somewhere in the background, which is, I think, a tragedy. So thank you for your question, but I think sometimes just a study of the figurative framework, the study of focalization, a study of the storytelling process in a literary work can actually be enough. And I think that should be the foregrounded, accentuated version of reading a text rather than borrowed vocabulary from other registers. So thank you very much. And I'd love to know more about your research. So perhaps you can email me later. We can engage in a longer conversation.
Vishnu and maybe Niharika afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah, hello. Hello, sir. This was an insightful talk, so to say, but like I have like a few things to clarify and a question. So like when you initially meant like transcendental is plasticity, like I just wanted the clarification for that, and like absence flows and becomes quasi-present. So like these two lines, I was like not sure of how to understand them. Like the question that I wanted to ask was like when you were talking about synaptic self. So I was reading other texts related to consciousness in terms of integrated information theory. So that takes the consciousness and self to the level of quantum mechanics and like quantum entanglement and all that stuff. So how does the integration like IIT like place into these questions and like the two like clarifications? Yeah, so
yeah, I mean, first of all, I don't think I'm qualified to answer your question, because I actually know almost nothing about quantum physics apart from just a curious engagement with it. So I won't venture into a response to your question. But I think in terms of your clarifications, I think what I meant when I said that transcendental is also plastic is, in a way, it rescues transcendental philosophy from the allegation of a grand narrative, right? And it's sort of saying, that's why I mentioned that Malabou actually goes back to Kant and so rescues Kant. And then there is the spoken Heidegger, and there's this, the whole tradition that she's following. And the engagement that she's making through this very interesting framework is looking at how even transcendental philosophy actually accommodates plurality and openness. It is something which is auto-open in a way. It doesn't sort of impose a narrative, but there are these fault lines even inside Kant's philosophical discourses, which are not just accommodated but also celebrated, in a way it's foregrounded. So I think any serious study of transcendental philosophy must also spot the fault lines which are very much embedded in those frameworks, right? So I think it's a little fashionable to look at that tradition of philosophy as sort of a pre-Derrida thing, and hence nothing happened before. So there's no deconstruction in Kant, there's no deconstruction in Hegel, etc. I mean, Hegel is massive. I mean, everyone loves, even the most hardcore Derridian scholars today, they sort of start with Hegel, and I mentioned Malabou today, but even Zizek does it in different ways, right? In fact, Malabou has this really interesting book called The Future Hegel, I think, if I'm not mistaken, where she talks about how the futuristic quality of Hegel's philosophy, how the dialectic is also deconstructive in very interesting ways. So I think what I meant is how what we sometimes conveniently classify as transcendental philosophy is actually a very deconstructive discourse in its own right. And that deconstructive quality must be acknowledged in a serious study. So that's the clarification. I hope that was a clarification for your first question. And the second bit about absence being a quasi-presence, I think I was alluding to the title of Malabou's book, Plasticity, the Promise of Explosion, right? And again, the word promise has a temporal quality to it. It's that, the Beckettian quality about something may or may not happen. And when it happens, will it end there, or does it have a more teleological quality about it, etc. So I think that ontological temporal quality is something which we need to acknowledge, because even absence comes from a presence in a certain way, but also and this is the whole idea of plasticity. It's a vessel or a framework or an ontological condition which can accept a pattern, but also produce patterns. And that's the basic, very almost mathematical definition of plasticity that Malabou espouses, right? It can accept a pattern, but also produce a pattern. So plasticity is that interface where absence and presence meet. Of course, they're constantly informing each other. And I think what is helpful for us to realize or maybe understand as students of literature is we need to look at these categories as non-dualistic categories, right? Just like we're looking at remembering and forgetting as non-dualistic categories, rather as connected categories, categories which shape each other. So, you know, remembering is shaped by forgetting, forgetting is shaped by remembering. So likewise, there is this constant interplay between absence and presence in terms of how they shape each other ontologically as well as functionally, right? So that would be my quick response to your clarification. And I honestly don't want to embarrass myself into going into quantum physics because I just have a very amateurish understanding of it, but I by no means qualified to answer your question, which is an excellent question, by the way.
I think Niharika has put a question in the chat box. Thank you for the response, Professor Parui. So I'm just going to read it out for you. My question is on chunking. She has two moments and she wants to know whether they could be called chunking. One, in Dory Lobb's article on testimony of Holocaust, a witness says that she saw four chimneys blown up, but it was only one. Is this an act of chunking? The second example comes from the movie Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. There's this erasing of memory, she says, of the protagonist's love life. How is it they can remove certain memories and not others? Is that chunking again?
Yeah, so I'll take the second question first. I mean, that is one film which is constantly mentioned in almost all discussions in memory studies. I mean, it's a wonderful film, obviously, but I think it's also quite problematic in many ways. I mean, because it really plays up the very uneasy relationship between memory and capitalism, you know, in terms of how you can essentially buy your way to forget certain things. And, you know, there's nice experimental apparatus out there which can help you forget and remember certain chunks. So I think I'm not entirely sure that is chunking, but that's a different discourse altogether, Translation of Spotless Mind. But what that does, and that's something which we see even before in trauma studies in terms of how certain memories are repressed deliberately, medically, in order to help the subject cope and sort of move on as well. So that there is that coping mechanism about forgetting as well. In terms of the first question, it's fascinating. I haven't read that article, but I must. In terms of how she saw four chimneys blown up, but it was only one. So I think that's interesting, whether to call it chunking or not, because there's always this multiplicity that happens over here. You know, you see one chimney going up, but she claims to have seen four different chimneys. So it also is an example of what we call amplification in a certain way, right? So it's an amplified memory, and because of the high intensity of the memory, the high intensity of that, the visual intensity of that, it just gets amplified, and the encoding happens in a very interesting way. I mean, very fundamentally speaking, memory operates in three stages sequentially. So encoding, consolidation, and retrieval. Right. So that is an example more of encoding rather than chunking, I would say, because the entire encoding process, which has shaped the subsequent processes of consolidation and retrieval, that is where the high intensity encoding has happened, which is why there's this, you know, problem between one chimney and four chimney. There is an amplification quality about it, which I think is interesting. And obviously, you know, it's a testimony of the Holocaust. So there is that grotesque quality about the memory, which is immediately, you know, it's almost uncanny in a certain way. So that uncanny, defamiliarized quality, I think, lends itself to the multiplicity, which is what is happening over here. So yeah, thank you very much.
Is there another question from the floor? So maybe if I may just quickly add to this very interesting conversation that's happening, I was also thinking about, again, the way the way we could think about the question of plasticity vis-a-vis the dialectic. I mean, especially in terms of the way Malabou almost goes back to a kind of delusion idea of becoming, where as she critiques that sort of, you know, the critique of the idea of metamorphosis in Kafka's story that she produces is a critique because that's not plasticity for her, because it stops at a certain form. And she has this critique of the Ovidian idea of metamorphosis as well. So in a certain sense, if we are talking about the ontology of form being plastic, which is at least one of the implications of the claim that she seems to be making, I'm wondering, what does it say about the dialectical possibilities of memory? Would memory be almost free of a certain dialectical tension then, if it's constantly moving in this direction of plasticity? Or would it be a certain intensification of the dialectic, to put it in a different sense, where, of course, perhaps following Derrida, she would be talking about this constant movement of contradiction and impasses in a dialectical movement rather than a synthesis to kind of wrap it up in a certain way. So again, I mean, it's a thought, because I teach quite a bit of Malabou texts and some of these texts in a course on psychoanalysis and cognitive philosophy. I was also thinking about some of these points as you were discussing them. For example, the point where absence clearly comes in that small book, earlier book on what should we do with our brains, where she talks about that moment where not all neural patterns will become images. So there will be a certain, I mean, though from what I remember, she doesn't use the word absence there, but there's at least a difference between the neural patterns and the images. And that could be of the order of absence. But again, with a very strong dialectical relation with presence. So I'm kind of wondering about the dialectics of memory, essentially, in the context of the kind of opening Malabou's work affords us.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, because I think what Malabou does, I mean, especially in this particular book, The Promise of Explosion, is to see how the free-flowing intensity of what we call the plastic can actually also become monstrous in very interesting ways, can also become a grand narrative in its own right, and can actually impose an order of totalitarianism, an order of control and coercion. So I think that is exactly what makes the work so interesting for me, because this is what I mentioned, I think, in passing when I said that this is also a caution that we need to exercise about postmodernism as well. To look at postmodernism intensity as something which sort of liberates and free flows and emancipates the subject is perhaps a little incorrect, because we've seen historically so many examples of how the postmodern impulse being co-opted into a grand narrative. And I remember the first time I actually thought about it in a very interesting way is through a pop reference of Kurt Cobain. And there's this really interesting interview of Cobain, I think, where he says something to the effect of that nothing works better for MTV than an anti-MTV statement, right? And Cobain is interesting because Cobain's rise as a musician and the rise of the global music industry was almost simultaneous, right? And also his suicide is so, or the way he died, is so symbolic as well, in terms of, you can't just resist this capital. Whatever you do, you're just going to co-opt into some kind of a avant-garde. And again, avant-garde is such a problematic topic as well, in terms of how what liberates you from the pattern, what liberates you from that sort of sense of censorship or coercion, etc., can actually become the next big thing. So I think you're absolutely right about the dialectical tension, and I think memory also works in a very interesting way. Similar structural patterns, because there is that quality about subversive memory. There's this quality about memory which is private and which goes against the grain, so to speak. But we've also seen historical examples of how those memory narratives can also be co-opted by the politics of totalitarianism in terms of amping up a certain narrative, in terms of pushing a certain kind of propaganda. In fact, that essay by Erll, I think she refers to a really interesting book, an essay by Words, I think it's called What is a Nation, very recent essay, which talks about Russian memory and how, incidentally, that essay that Erll mentions was published right before the Russian-Ukraine invasion. And in that essay by Words, What is a Nation, I think, he talks about how the constant memory that Russia has about collective memory, which is created, is that of the victim, is that of something, a bigger outsider coming to take over, which sounds like the memory of someone with less agency, which appears to be a memory directed against totalitarianism, which appears to be a memory directed against something bigger, stronger. But what's fascinating and maybe depressing is the way in which that narrative of memory gets so quickly connected to legitimize the foreign policies in terms of, let's say, expansionism of Russia, decision to attack another country, because that memory, which is constantly consumed and circulated, the memory of the victim, the memory of the other, the memory of the marginalized, is so conveniently redesigned to sort of back certain kinds of military invasion, back certain kind of foreign policies, is absolutely fascinating. So I think the whole idea of the different kinds of memory free flowing across each other is absolutely fascinating. But what we also need to be careful here is how non-immune, for want of a better word, how non-immune memory is against the politics of appropriation, right? And we have enough examples in our own country as well, don't we? But I think history is full of examples of subversive memories becoming absolutely weaponized in terms of propagating certain kinds of political orders. So I think Malabou also leaves it at that. I think she doesn't talk about plasticity as an emancipatory category, but I think there is enough hint in Malabou's work as well to suggest that plasticity can also become the next order of monstrosity and coercion and control.
As a question, please go ahead, Angel.
Yeah, thank you so much. So it was very comprehensive, very stimulating, like, my God. But on a slightly, maybe this is like a little unrelated to larger questions of plasticity, but I was quick, because you mentioned trauma and forgetting and the relationship that has with medical humanities. I was a little curious about the relationship that is there between, so for example, trauma, forgetting, and the cultural understanding of, say, caregiving. And this question is coming from a place of, say, for example, there are lots of literary texts that talk about medical conditions that cause memory loss, right? So dementia or Alzheimer's, and the idea that when it comes to caregiving of such vulnerable communities, there is this idea of corporeality that is tied to it. The fact that it is encoded in the body itself. The trauma is encoded in the body. So I'm just curious about how all of this ties together and what you think about these intersections between, say, trauma, forgetting, caregiving, and corporeality.
Yeah, it's very interesting because caregiving connects to the other complex. I had half a mind to bring that as well, but I didn't at the end. But the other complex category of empathy, right? Because just like memory, empathy can just be this huge umbrella, because there is this molecular prefrontal lobe idea of empathy, mirror neurons firing away, all of that. But also there is a social dimension of empathy, right? In terms of how you can socially empathize with someone. And that constant traffic between the neural and the social is exactly what empathy does. So it's possible to have collective empathy. In fact, there have been studies on, let's say, cinema, which also does that. You empathize with, the whole idea of the superstardom or stardom. You want to be like that. You associate yourself with that in very spectacular collective ways. But there's also empathy as a micromotor mechanism, as the ability, the desire to care for someone else. But I think what's really interesting is how you bring in corporeality over here. And I would just push that a little bit more and say that perhaps it's more helpful to look at this through the lens of intercorporeality rather than corporeality, right? Because what we are essentially doing is to study the dynamics of different bodies, the more abled body caring for the less abled body, right? So the entire intercorporeal economy, which opens up through caregiving and the process of caring for someone else, is fascinating. And it is intersubjective, obviously, but also intercorporeal. I think if I were to do a research like this, I'd perhaps have engaged with intercorporeality more in terms of looking at how the different politics of the body come together. But also, and this is the interesting bit, when I mention intercorporeality, there is ability to connect, the desire to connect. But I think there's also, at the end of the day, the very clear retention of different bodies, right? So it is the abled body at the end of the day, which is taking care of the less abled body. So, and that is a really interesting bit, the hierarchy of different forms of ableism, the different forms of being able, more able or less able. And my question to you, I probably sound like a supervisor now, But the question to someone like you would be, does this complex intercorporeality, which retains different forms of ableism, etc., does it undercut empathy or does it accentuate empathy, right? Because if you're looking at empathy as a desire to connect, to become someone else, right? That's the difference between empathy and sympathy. I'm imagining myself as someone else. But if you're doing it through an intercorporeal framework, are you actually becoming that body which you are taking care of? There is no neat answer. I'm absolutely aware of that. But I think that is a really interesting bit, because that's where you can bring in, let's say, the clinical study of care, but also connected to, I don't know, not just philosophy, but phenomenology, I think, in very interesting ways, right? I mean, Merleau-Ponty comes to mind right away in terms of how, you're creating this affective economy, an intercorporeality, but is there a dynamic to it, which is at the end of the day, hierarchical, right? And does a hierarchy connect to empathy, accentuate it, or does it undercut it, right? I probably made it more confused, but.
No, it is fascinating. This is something for me to think about. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, this is a fascinating conversation, and I hate to put an end to it, but unless there's a last question, I'm just aware of time. Maybe we could wind it up. Just a very quick, it's not a question. I was just thinking about this as you were speaking, especially about forgetfulness, Professor Parui, because very recently I was reading this article, I think, that has come out very recently as well, by Amit Chaudhry, where he talks about fiction and forgetfulness. And one of the implications of that would go very interestingly with what you were suggesting there. So he talks about readers who may not read the entire book and might drop it off at a certain point where the narrative is precisely at the crossroads and there are multiple possibilities, and maybe they don't want one possibility to be actualized. So they'll just leave it at that so that they can write it. And he makes this very interesting argument about non-reading from that point as a kind of writing, literally or metaphorically. But in a certain sense, though he doesn't really connect this strand with forgetfulness, there's also a certain metaphorical idea of forgetfulness here, as in forgetting to read the rest of it, as it were. So again, it sort of brings back, I suppose, the notion of forgetfulness in this very operation of reading, writing, and imagining the rest of a story, perhaps, where the reader becomes a writer. So I was just kind of, it was an article that made me think, and it, in a way, came back to me as you were discussing some of these questions.
I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because what we're seeing here are two different things. One is perhaps the refusal to complete the reading project, right? If you look at reading as a project, the refusal to leave it incomplete. And I know that has, I think, really complex implications, the level of agency, at the level of readerly agency, but also, I think, at the level of subjectivity, that I don't want this to go beyond this direction. Right. And I think at a very banal level, we have seen this, ever since we started watching films or reading books as well. People telling us that if only they left it at that point, right? Why did this end happen? Why did they have to end in this particular way? And that is a very common readerly response, I think, especially with cinema. I think cinema is more fertile that way. And I think I'm not an expert in cinema by any means, but I'm very interested in the idea of stardom in cinema, I think, and that is in a way perhaps analogous to what you just mentioned, in terms of a big star getting killed in a film, that reluctance or resistance to see that, the refusal to see that, and that in a way also connects to Angel's question about empathy in a certain way, I think, because a large part of empathy we know through research in neuroscience is actually about imagination. I mean, the molecular mechanism of empathy is imagination. You're imagining yourself as someone else. Now, what that means is, at a very neural way, that you're sort of transposing yourself as someone. That's wonderful. But the more complex thing, and again, this is temporal as well, there is a futuristic quality about empathy, right? Something that you are becoming or about to become. Right. Now, I think that is what is probably happening. I haven't read that essay. I'm aware of it, but I should now that you mentioned that, is the whole idea of I've already imagined something out of my readerly engagement with the text. And I want to end the imagination there. That is a narrative I want to project myself as arriving at in a certain way. And the refusal to retain the narrative in a different direction and then leaving it at that, right? It almost has, in a very perverse medical way, it almost has a phantom limb-like quality to it, right? Because it is a limb that I want to hold on to, although it's not there anymore. And it's still itching there. I still want to feel it. And that connects, obviously, very complexly with spectrality, absence, etc. We talked about all that. But I think the phantom limb metaphor is really interesting in memory studies because A, it is very medical. It's something which is anatomical, medical, this is real tissue and blood and neurons attached to it. But this constant memory of something which is not there, which cannot be there in future. But at the same time, you want to imagine it, not just in the past. And this is the interesting thing about phantom limb. It's not just a memory of the past, it's a memory of the future in a certain way. You're remembering it because you want to sort of think of it in terms of how you move ahead in time. And I think in a certain sense, every literary text is a little bit like a phantom limb, isn't it? It is in a very empathetic, readerly way. It is a part of you that you want to retain, perhaps. And like you said, when you see that happening in a different direction, that's where the empathetic reader takes over rather than an interpretative reader. So leaving it in between. And of course, one can go more post-structuralist about it and think about the whole idea of the writerly text and readerly text, but I've never been a big fan of that, to be honest. But I think it's more interesting to look at it from a more molecular mechanism, perhaps, in terms of how my empathetic engagement with the literary text is not just, a moment in the present, but also investment in future. Right. It's a temporal investment. And if that future is not happening, I stop it because I want to stop the future at that point and freeze it at a certain moment rather than let myself be taken to a future I don't want to go to. So it just gets political as well. But I think that's what's happening there. So.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. And I think that's a fitting note for us to end with a certain degree of expectation and hope for the future. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. And thank you so much, Professor Parui, for your time. And I do apologize about that weird technical situation that we had.
It's my fault entirely.
Okay.
But thank you very much for having me. And I look forward to a continuing collaboration with Ayati Gandhinagar. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone. Bye.